Once upon a time, in a quiet corner of Columbus, Ohio, stood a small diner called Lancaster Grill. It wasn't the kind of place that made headlines or drew crowds from across town. It was just a simple restaurant tucked between a gas station and a laundromat, the kind of place where truckers stopped for a hot cup of coffee, where families gathered for Sunday breakfast, and where the waitstaff memorized your order before they even learned your name. Megan had been working there for almost 3 years. She wasn't the kind of person who sought out trouble. She had never been the one to stir the pot or push back against authority. She believed in showing up, doing her job, and treating people with kindness, just as she had been taught growing up. Work hard, respect others, and keep your head down when things got messy. That was her way. The job wasn't glamorous. The pay was barely enough to scrape by. The shifts were long, and the management didn't seem to care much about anything beyond keeping the doors open. But Megan had bills to pay. Her rent was already too high for a small one-bedroom apartment, and her younger brother, Evan, was in his second year of college. He didn't know, but whenever their mother couldn't cover his expenses, Megan quietly sent extra money for his textbooks and groceries. That was why she took the double shifts, why she smiled even when customers barely acknowledged her, why she endured co-workers who saw kindness as a weakness. But Lancaster Grill wasn't just a difficult workplace. It was a place where things operated under unspoken rules. She had watched it happen over and over again. A well-dressed businessman would receive warm greetings and easy conversation. A construction worker in paint-stained overalls rushed service and forced smiles. And if someone looked like they might not tip, some of the staff wouldn't even bother trying. Megan hated it, but calling it out wasn't an option. She had learned that the hard way a few months ago when she made a passing comment about a table being left unattended for too long while Beth, a senior waitress, scrolled through her phone. Beth had looked her dead in the eye and said, "You don't get paid extra for being a saint, Megan." That was how things worked. Either you went along with it, or you learned to keep your mouth shut. Megan had chosen the latter until that night. It was a slow Wednesday evening. The dinner rush had come and gone, leaving behind the kind of quiet Megan didn't mind. Fewer customers meant fewer complaints, fewer spills, and fewer fake smiles from her coworkers, who only bothered with good service when it suited them. She was at the counter, refilling the sugar dispensers, when the bell above the door jingled. An older black man walked in. His clothes were clean but slightly worn, a simple button-up and slacks. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive. He carried himself with quiet confidence. But Megan noticed the brief hesitation in his posture, the way he scanned the room before stepping forward. She had seen that look before, especially in customers who already knew what kind of welcome they were, or weren't, about to get. The response was immediate. Beth, still leaning against the counter, didn't even glance up from her phone. Jason, another server, looked toward the door, made eye contact with the man for half a second, and then turned back to his conversation, laughing at something meaningless. No greeting. No, welcome to Lancaster Grill. Just silence. Megan felt the weight of it. Thick, uncomfortable. This wasn't an accident. Her co-workers had made a choice. For a second, she considered keeping her head down. It would be easier. It always was. But then she looked back at the man. He was waiting. Not impatiently, not rudely, just waiting, as if he was giving them a chance to prove him wrong. Just this once. Megan wiped her hands on a napkin, grabbed a menu, and walked straight over. "Evening, sir," she said, her voice warm but casual. "Just you tonight?" The man met her eyes, and something in his expression softened. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. Megan smiled and gestured toward an open booth near the window. "Follow me. You okay with the booth?" "Perfectly fine," he said as he settled in. She handed him a menu and pulled the pen from behind her ear. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" "Coffee," he said. "Black." Coming right up. She moved quickly, grabbing a fresh pot and pouring his cup herself. Even as she worked, she could feel Beth's eyes on her. She could feel Jason watching too, but she didn't turn around. As she set the coffee down in front of him, the man glanced around the restaurant, then back at her. "You the only one working tonight?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Megan knew exactly what he meant. She flicked her gaze toward the others. Beth, now whispering something to Jason, both of them barely trying to hide their smirks. Feels like it sometimes, she said. That made him chuckle. He flipped open a menu and scanned the options. What's good here? Megan tilted her head, thinking. Depends on what you're in the mood for. If you want something solid, the pot roast is made fresh. But if you want my personal favorite, the grilled salmon is the way to go. He raised an eyebrow. That's so. She nodded. Promise you won't regret it. A small, genuine smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Salmon it is. Megan jotted it down. Great choice. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she heard Beth mutter just loud enough to be heard. She's wasting her time. Megan clenched her jaw, but kept moving. By the time she placed the order and returned with a fresh coffee refill, she could feel the shift in the air. It was subtle, but it was there, the way Beth's eyes narrowed, the way Jason kept glancing toward the booth like he was waiting for Megan to slip up to say something she shouldn't. Even Tom, the manager, had peeked out from his office, scanning the room before disappearing again. Megan had the sinking feeling that she had just put a target on her back. She just didn't know how bad it was going to be yet. The next morning, Megan pulled into the parking lot of Lancaster Grill, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Something felt off. Maybe it was the way the cold air seemed sharper that day, biting through her jacket as she stepped out of her car. Or maybe it was the tight knot in her stomach, the lingering unease she hadn't been able to shake since last night. As she walked toward the entrance, she spotted Beth and Jason through the diner's front window. They were standing near the counter, whispering, their expressions unreadable. But as soon as she stepped inside, the energy in the room shifted. Beth leaned against the counter, arms crossed, a sly little smirk tugging at her lips. Jason stood beside her, arms folded, a glint of amusement in his eyes. They were waiting for something. Megan ignored them, adjusting the strap of her apron over her shoulder as she headed toward the back to clock in. Then she heard it, the sound of a door creaking open. She turned just in time to see Tom, the manager, standing in the doorway of his office. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he looked at her, like he had been expecting this moment. Megan, he said flatly, come with me. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Beth and Jason, who were both watching now, their smirks deepening. Something was wrong. Megan followed Tom into his office, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The room was cramped, the desk cluttered with old receipts, paperwork, and a coffee mug with a dried stain at the bottom. He didn't bother to sit. Instead, he leaned back against the desk, exhaled, and met her eyes. We're letting you go. The words hit like a slap. Megan blinked, her mind scrambling to process what he had just said. What? Tom's expression didn't change. It's not working out. A cold weight settled in her stomach. Not working out? She repeated, a sharp, humorless laugh escaping her lips. I've been here for almost 3 years. I've never missed a shift, never been late. Tom exhaled through his nose, like he was already tired of this conversation. It's a decision we've made. Megan knew what that meant. She swallowed the lump in her throat. This is because of last night, isn't it? Tom didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. Megan felt heat rise to her face. So I get fired for doing my job? Tom's fingers tapped against the desk. You can collect your final paycheck next week. That was it. No warning. No explanation. Just out. Megan clenched her fists, but she knew there was no point in arguing. Slowly, she untied her apron and sat on the chair. As she turned to leave, she hesitated at the door, forcing herself to look back at Tom. You know this isn't right, she said, voice steady. Tom didn't even flinch. Megan shook her head and walked out. When she stepped back into the main dining area, Beth was still standing by the counter, a knowing smirk playing at the corners of her lips. Jason pretended to wipe down a table, but he wasn't even trying to hide the satisfaction in his eyes. They'd been waiting for this moment. Megan felt her face burn, not with embarrassment, but with anger. She wanted to say something. She wanted to call them out, to demand to know how they could be so damn heartless. But she didn't. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Lifting her chin, she walked past them without a word, pushing through the doors into the cold morning air. For the first time in 3 years, she had no job, no paycheck, no backup plan. She got in her car, slammed the door shut, and gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. How was she going to pay rent? How was she going to help Evan with his groceries? How was she? Her phone buzzed. Megan ignored it at first, staring blankly at the windshield, her thoughts spiraling. Then she glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She hesitated, then, with a shaking hand, she answered. Hello. A deep voice came through the line, steady and familiar. Megan, the man said. This is Richard Lawson. Megan frowned. I'm sorry, who? The man you served last night at Lancaster Grill. Her breath caught. She sat up a little straighter. Oh, yes, sir. How can I help you? There was a pause. Then Richard said something that made her entire world tilt on its axis. I heard what happened. Megan's stomach twisted. Of course he had. News traveled fast in places like Lancaster Grill. Yeah, well, she said, forcing out a bitter laugh. Guess I should have just ignored you like everyone else. Richard's next words made her freeze. That's exactly why I'm calling. Megan sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The morning chill seeped through the windows, but she barely felt it. The weight of what had just happened would have been taken from her, pressed heavy on her chest. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she had been fired without warning, without reason. Beth's smirk, Jason's smug satisfaction, Tom's cold, indifferent tone, it all replayed in her mind like a cruel joke. She had spent 3 years giving this job everything she had. 3 years showing up early, staying late, covering shifts no one else wanted, treating every customer with the same respect, only to be tossed aside like she was nothing. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She ignored it first, staring blankly out the windshield, trying to process what the hell she was supposed to do next. But then, curiosity, or maybe just desperation for a distraction, got the best of her. She glanced down. Unknown number. For a second, she considered letting it go to voicemail. But something, instinct, fate, whatever you want to call it, made her reach for the phone and answer. Hello. A deep voice came through the line, steady and familiar. Megan, this is Richard Lawson. She frowned, confused. I'm sorry, who? The man you served last night at Lancaster Grill. Her breath caught. She sat up a little straighter. Oh, she said, trying to gather herself. Yes, sir. How can I help you? There was a pause. Then Richard's voice came again, calm but deliberate. I heard what happened. Megan let out a bitter laugh before she could stop herself. Of course he had. Word traveled fast in places like Lancaster Grill. Yeah, well, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Guess I should have just ignored you like everyone else. Richard's next words stopped her cold. That's exactly why I'm calling. Megan blinked. I don't understand. Another pause. Then Richard said something that made her grip the phone tighter. Megan, I wasn't just there for dinner last night. His voice was measured, like he was choosing his words carefully. I was there to see how my employees treat people. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Your employees. Slowly, she found her voice. Wait, what? I own Lancaster Grill, Richard said simply. Her heart slammed against her ribs. I'm sorry, what? You heard me. Megan pressed a hand to her temple, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. So you're telling me you own the place? The entire restaurant? Yes, Richard confirmed. And last night, I was checking in. No formal inspections, no warnings. I like to see how things really operate when no one knows I'm watching. Megan felt like the ground had just shifted beneath her. And what did you see? She asked. Richard let out a slow breath. That I have a serious problem with my staff. Megan scoffed, shaking her head. Yeah, no kidding. There was another pause before Richard spoke again, his tone softer now. How long have you worked there? Almost 3 years, she answered automatically. 3 years, Richard repeated. And in that time you've what? Never missed a shift. Not once, Megan said, jaw tightening. Never been late, never called out. I keep my head down, do my job, treat people like human beings. She exhaled, frustration creeping into her voice. But apparently, that was enough to get me fired. That's exactly why I'm calling, Richard said. Megan frowned. I still don't get it. Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. I let them fire you on purpose. Silence. Megan's stomach dropped. You what? I needed to see what they would do, Richard explained. I wanted to know if this was just about bad service or if it was something deeper. And now I have my answer. Megan shook her head, still trying to wrap her mind around it. So you let them throw me out just to prove a point? I know it wasn't fair, Richard admitted. But now I know exactly who I can't trust to run my business the way it should be run. Megan felt her pulse thudding in her ears. And what does that mean for me? Richard's tone shifted, growing firm. It means I need someone I can trust, he said. Someone who actually understands what it means to run a restaurant fairly. Someone who doesn't pick and choose who gets treated with dignity based on their own prejudices. Megan frowned. I still don't see what this has to do with me. Richard's next words stopped her cold. I want you to come back, he said. Megan blinked. Come back. As what? A waitress? No, Richard said. As the new manager. Megan's breath caught. I what? You heard me, Richard said. I fired your manager this morning. Tom's done. Her mouth fell open. Tom, fired. Beth and Jason were going to lose their minds. I know this is sudden, Richard continued, but I'm not interested in anyone else taking over. You understand what matters in a workplace. You know how people should be treated. That's exactly what Lancaster Grill needs. Megan swallowed hard. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. Yes, you can, Richard said firmly. And you should. Megan stared out the windshield, her mind spinning. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been tossed aside like she didn't matter. And now, she was being offered the very position of the man who had fired her. She took a slow breath, gripping the phone tighter. What do you say? Richard asked. Megan hesitated. She could still hear Beth's mocking voice, Jason's smug silence, Tom's dismissive tone. They had counted her out, thought they had gotten rid of her for good. But now she had a chance to be the change they never saw coming. Megan lifted her chin. I'll do it, she said. Richard let out a satisfied breath. Good. Come in tomorrow morning. You start at 8. Megan nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I'll be there. As she hung up, she sat in stunned silence for a moment, gripping the wheel as the reality of it all sank in. Less than a day ago, she had walked out of Lancaster Grill with nothing. Tomorrow, she would be walking back in as the boss. The next morning, Megan stood outside Lancaster Grill, gripping the strap of her bag. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too preoccupied with what was about to happen. Yesterday, she had walked out of this place with nothing. No job, no paycheck, no respect. Today, she was walking back in with the one thing Beth, Jason, and Tom had never imagined she would have. Power. She inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders, and pushed open the door. The scent of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, just as it always had. Customers were scattered throughout the booths, the hum of conversation blending with the soft background music playing on a radio. At first, no one noticed her. Then Beth turned from the counter, saw her, and froze. Jason, who had been laughing with a busboy, caught sight of her too. His mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. A flicker of something, confusion, unease, crossed his face. Megan let the moment stretch, just long enough to watch them squirm. Then she walked toward the counter, setting her bag down with purpose. Beth recovered first, scoffing as she crossed her arms. What the hell are you doing here? Megan tilted her head slightly. You'll find out soon enough. Beth's smirk faltered. Before she could say anything else, a door opened at the back of the restaurant. Tom stepped out from his office, already flipping through a stack of papers. Beth, I need you to... Then he saw her. His entire body went rigid. His eyes flicked between Megan, Beth, and Jason, trying to piece together what was happening. Megan, he said slowly, you don't work here anymore. Megan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Actually, she said, I do. Tom blinked, completely thrown. What? Another voice cut in before Megan could answer. I believe I can clarify that. Every head in the room turned. Richard Lawson walked in, calm and collected, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. His presence shifted the energy in the room instantly. Beth's face paled. Jason looked like he wished he could disappear. Tom, for once, was speechless. Richard took his time, scanning the restaurant before landing his gaze on Tom. As of this morning, Richard said, his voice measured but firm, Lancaster Grill has undergone some management changes. He let the words settle before continuing. Effective immediately, Tom, your position is terminated. A stunned silence followed. Beth let out a sharp gasp. Jason stiffened as if he had been physically struck. Tom's face turned an ugly shade of red. Wait a damn minute. No. Richard cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. I've already heard enough from you. Tom's mouth snapped shut. Megan almost felt bad for him. Almost. Richard turned his attention to the rest of the staff. I'm sure some of you are wondering what's going on, he continued. Let me make it simple. Last night, I visited this restaurant as a regular customer. He let that sink in, and what I witnessed was unacceptable. No one dared to speak. Richard gestured toward Megan. This woman was the only employee who treated me with respect. The only one who did her job the way it should be done. He turned back to the staff, his expression hardening. The rest of you? Some of you ignored me completely. Some of you made it clear you had no interest in serving certain customers at all. His voice sharpened. That ends today. The silence in the restaurant was thick. Then Richard turned back to Megan. Megan is your new manager. Beth's mouth fell open. Jason's jaw clenched. A young busboy standing near the kitchen looked like he wanted to clap. Megan finally let herself smile. She turned to Beth and Jason, who were still too stunned to speak, and leaned against the counter. Well, she said lightly, this is awkward. Beth's expression twisted in fury. You? She turned to Richard, her voice sharp. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, Richard said smoothly. You don't like it? You're free to leave. Beth snapped her mouth shut, nostrils flaring. She wasn't stupid. She knew walking out meant losing her paycheck, and Beth wasn't about to do that. Jason, on the other hand, wasn't as smart. This is bulls. You're welcome to quit as well, Richard interrupted. Jason froze, his mouth opening and closing like he was doing the math in his head. Beth glared daggers at Megan. Megan just smiled back. Looks like we all have a lot of adjusting to do, she said, her voice light but firm. So let's get to work. She watched as Beth stormed toward the coffee machine, mumbling under her breath. Jason grabbed a rag and started wiping down a table, his movements stiff with anger. Richard turned to Megan, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with the slightest nod of approval, he said, I have a feeling you'll do just fine here. Megan exhaled slowly, watching as the restaurant settled into a new reality, one where she was in charge. And for the first time since she had walked into this building 3 years ago, she felt something she hadn't before. Respect. Megan had expected resistance. She welcomed it. Beth barely spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. Her usual smirks were replaced with tight-lipped silence, her resentment simmering just beneath the surface. Jason sulked through every shift, making it painfully obvious that he was only sticking around because he had no better options. A few of the other employees, the ones who had always played along with the old way of doing things, made no effort to hide their disdain. Megan didn't care. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to make things right. The first few days as manager, she didn't make any drastic changes. Not yet. Instead, she observed. She watched how people moved, how they interacted, who did their jobs without complaint, and who only put in effort when they thought someone important was watching. And then, she started to shake things up. She made it clear that the favoritism, the selective service, the quiet but deliberate exclusion of certain customers, it was over. Every customer would be treated with respect, no matter how they dressed, no matter how much they tipped, no matter who they were. The pushback came almost immediately. Jason made a point of dragging his feet when serving tables that he wouldn't have bothered with before. Beth rolled her eyes at nearly everything Megan said, responding with sarcastic comments under her breath. One of the other servers, a guy named Pete, outright quit the moment he realized Megan wasn't bluffing about the new rules. Megan let him go without hesitation. She didn't lose sleep over the ones who walked out. If they couldn't handle treating people with basic decency, they had no place here. And yet, despite the resistance, she began to see change. The younger staff, employees who had been following Beth and Jason's lead simply because they thought that was the way things worked, started paying attention to Megan instead. They saw the way she handled customers, the way she made an effort to treat every single person with the same level of respect. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly, the energy in the restaurant shifted. The kitchen staff, who had always kept their heads down, started speaking up more. They offered suggestions, pointed out inefficiencies, and for the first time, it felt like their voices actually mattered. Customers who had been ignored in the past started coming in more often. Some of them seemed hesitant at first, waiting to see if things had really changed. But after a few visits, their smiles became more genuine. Megan noticed the way they started lingering longer, chatting more. Tips began to increase. Not because they were forced, not because customers felt obligated, but because they actually wanted to show appreciation. Then, one afternoon, Richard Lawson walked in. Megan was in the middle of balancing invoices when she heard his voice. "How's my investment doing?" She looked up, pushing the paperwork aside, and smirked. "I think we're in good shape." Richard glanced around. The restaurant was busy, not just with customers, but with something more. There was a different energy now, lighter, more purposeful. Employees moved with intention. The usual tension in the air replaced with something closer to ease. Richard nodded, satisfied. "Told you you'd be fine." Megan leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "You didn't exactly give me a choice." Richard chuckled. "No, I didn't." Megan exhaled, looking around. "It's weird," she admitted. "For the longest time, this job was just a paycheck. And now," Richard's expression softened. "Now it's something more." She thought back to that morning in her car, gripping the steering wheel, feeling like she had lost everything. And yet, here she was. She wasn't just another waitress anymore. She was the one setting the rules now. And she had made damn sure that Lancaster Grill would never go back to the way it was. Megan stood by the counter, watching the restaurant move around her. It was strange, seeing the same walls, the same booths, the same kitchen she had worked in for years, but knowing that everything had changed. She had changed. Not too long ago, she had been just another waitress, overlooked, undervalued, easily discarded. She had walked out of this building with nothing but anger and disappointment, believing that the system was too broken to fight against. But now, she was the one calling the shots. She had taken the very place that had tossed her aside and turned it into something better. The favoritism, the quiet discrimination, the toxic culture, it was gone. In its place was something new, something stronger. A workplace where respect was given, not just to those who were deemed worthy by shallow standards, but to everyone who walked through those doors. And people noticed. The regulars who had once been ignored now smiled when they saw her. The customers who had been dismissed without a second glance now felt like they belonged. Even the staff, those who had once resisted her, were beginning to fall in line, some grudgingly, some willingly, but all of them understanding that things weren't going back to the way they were. Richard had been right. She could do this. More importantly, she should do this. She thought back to that moment in Tom's office when she had been fired for doing the right thing. How easy it would have been to accept it as just another example of how unfair the world was. How easy it would have been to walk away, to let them win. But doing the right thing wasn't about doing what was easy. It was about standing your ground, even when it cost you something. It was about knowing your worth, even when others refused to see it. Megan wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a leader, and she had learned one of the most important lessons of all. No one can take away your value unless you let them. She took a slow breath, letting the sounds of the restaurant settle around her. The clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, the quiet but undeniable energy of a place that had found its way back to life. Then she smiled, because this was just the beginning. Integrity matters, and sometimes choosing to do the right thing doesn't just change your own life. It changes everything. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.